things that we want to address. And one of them is districts have a tendency to be myopic at this time of year, right? So they'll look at the annual budget and for 1 year, where our view, we need to really take a broader view of what funding options are available to us, and also a longer view, because S2 and the lack of state aid or decreasing state aid is going to continue for 3 more years after this budget. So we'll need to be aware of that. We also want to integrate our annual operating budget thinking into the capital planning and understand how options have dissipated for us to be able to handle some very critical and urgent capital project needs, which we'll be incorporating into this presentation, and that culminates in 2 action points for tonight's agenda. One is the adoption of the annual budget for next year, and the other is the endorsement and support to initiate a referendum for November 2021. But first things first, let's talk about the annual school budget. On the screen, you'll see here are the headlines of the budget, if you will. It's stabilized this year, and as Dr. Sampson mentioned, there's some unique, non-recurring benefits that have allowed that to happen. So the state aid cuts continue under Senate Bill 2, and our property tax increase is at 2%. Now that's a capped number. Our property tax increase at 2% is 2.8 million, and we're losing 6.7 million in state aid. So the district is not able to backfill those losses in revenue quick enough under an independent law on a cap on the tax levy. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And pandemic-related savings has helped bolster our current budget position. That's a non-recurring revenue, all right? So we need to be aware and attentive to the structural integrity of our annual budgets and how we design our path going forward. On the expenditure side, the highlights of that are, or the lowlights of that is that we've dropped now to 4.8 million below the adequacy benchmark. So what that is it's the state's formula's determination of what amount of money is necessary to provide an adequate, a thorough and efficient education. So what is an adequate amount of money to accomplish that? So we are falling below that, and we think that's a piece of the S2 legislation that wasn't fully contemplated when it was initiated 3 years ago. But we'll bring that into focus as we move along also. Our state spending metrics speak to our efficiency. We'll take a look at that. It's the cost per pupil calculation that uses audited information. It's compiled by the state, grouped into sibling type districts for comparable purposes. We've always fared very well with that, and we continue to. And also stimulus funds. So the current version of stimulus funds, there's a current round of stimulus funds, has allocated to Freehold Regional $2.2 million. And what we have decided to do with that is to dedicate it to the full implementation of a one-to-one platform. It's a non-recurring revenue with a non-recurring expense, so that makes sense. And it's also something that, as we navigated through the pandemic, became clear that we need to, have that platform, that common platform in place for our students. So there's a dedication of effort there. Trish, if you would. So let's take a look. I'll give you a moment to look at the revenue stream, the revenue breakdown for our general fund. So relatively flat general fund budget. I'd like to touch base on a few things and then go a little bit deeper into them in the slides that follow. As I mentioned, increasing the tax levy is at 2%. And this what will be our 4th year in 7-year phase outs of funding of state aid. The hit is $6.7 million. Now, normally that would be a devastating cut, but we are able to stave that off for just 1 year, and the reason is, if you look at fund balance there, we're able to increase the amount of surplus that we've put towards this budget. The savings that Dr. Sampson referred to in his opening comments regarding COVID, what the district has decided to do is to split that into both short-term benefit through fund balance and supporting this year's annual budget, and also with a longer view, a deposit into our capital reserve. A capital reserve is, to parallel it to what we all have at home, is essentially a savings account with the funds dedicated to facilities. So we were able to put $5 million from last year's last few months of benefit from the pandemic towards that. In the current year, which is far less, it's a longer time, but it's less, we were able to use to supplement our fund balance appropriating and support this current year's budget. So we're remaining whole in that aspect. I'll also make mention of participation fees, which for the year that we're currently in, it was planned to implement, but with the pandemic, it's not something that we're able to do in any kind of meaningful way, so we abandoned that for the current year. We're also able to hold it off for next year, but certainly as our financial budget, as our annual budgets move on over time, we're going to be in less and less of a position to be able to hold off changes of that nature. So I'll also, one final comment on this is debt service fund. Take notice that the debt service fund is zero. So the debt service fund is, the purpose of that is to pay off long-term debt. The last referendum, successful referendum that the district had was some 20 years ago. And it's issuing of bonds to do Colts Neck High School, additions to other schools, and obviously, as we would at home, some purchase of a scale of that nature, you're not fitting into your annual budget. It's something that's similar to a mortgage, right? So you pay it off over 20 years. So referendums are periodic. They don't happen every handful of years. Our last one was more than 20 years ago. And last year we made our final payment on that. And that was really our jumping off point for the two referendums that have been offered since. One in October 2018, one in November 2019, both of which were unsuccessful. So it was to coordinate new debt with expiring debt and therefore keep the tax rate steady. So, but we're in a period here now where there is no debt service fund and no tax levy associated with that. I just wanted to note that as well. Tricia, do you want to go? So, state funding, right? So, this is one of the important takeaways here. Our budget, which is, for sake of discussion, I'll use round numbers, a $200 million budget, and has been. Prior to the implementation of S2, we received about $50 million from the state aid. So 25% of our budget was supported by state funding. At the end of S2, that $50 million will go down to $20 million. Right? So it's phasing out over time, but it's compounding too. So it's 5 million, 6 million, 6 million, and they're all in addition to bring us down to where we should be. Now the interesting part of this is the state is not saying that we spend too much. In fact, we're actually under what they say we should be spending. Their message is, you're not taxing enough. You have a greater ability to pay for your own education, so your tax rate should be higher. And this goes to S2 is a supplement to the School Funding Reform Act, the funding formula that's been in place since 2008, 2009. And here's the gist of it. Here's how it works. It's fairly straightforward, and it makes a lot of sense, and I am supportive of the approach that they're using for it. But it's a two-step process. The first is to quantify student needs, right? And then use that poured through the actual demographics on a district-by-district basis to arrive at an adequacy budget, right? So how much should this district need to provide a thorough and efficient education? And it's different for each district because no district has the exact same enrollment, right? So same cost model applied to the district-specific population, their characteristics and the costs associated with them to come to that district-unique number. So that's the first step the SFRA takes. The second is, okay, how are we going to pay for it? And their approach is that local communities, you go first through property taxes. So in order to do that, they measure a community's ability to pay for their own education. They use two wealth indicators, property value and income. And then they translate that into ability to pay. That's first up in meeting the adequacy budget dollar amount. Now, the method the state uses to translate those two wealth indicators into ability to pay has a multiplier, a factor in there, which changes year over year. And we'll look at the impact of that. But back to the overall design, local fair share, local community, property tax, that goes first, and whatever's left in order to get up to adequacy, the state picks up through state aid. Anything that a district spends above adequacy, the position of the state and the funding formula is you're entirely on your own on that community. We won't consider that for funding, for state funding. So that's the overall design concept of it. What should it cost, then how are we going to pay for it? Community first. Trish, if you could move to the next slide. Take a moment to get familiar with this. It's tax levy on one side, state aid on the other. The red lines are what the funding formula calls for. The green lines are what has actually happened. So as Dr. Sampson mentioned in his opening comments, there's a change in the level, in the measure of the community's ability to pay that does not align with what the actual changes in those two wealth indicators are. And it's been different each year. It's very difficult to predict. And you can see in the tax levy graph, according to the state's calculation for funding the adequacy budget, they believe that the district's tax levy should be where the red line is. And where it's not, it's at the green line. And corresponding reduction in state aid on the other side. All right, so S2 serves to shift funding, existing funding, from districts that are measured like this to districts that have far less ability to pay, far less local fair share. And it does that over a 7-year period. Interestingly, not interestingly, but importantly, the whole S2 and the SFRA is independent of a separate law that limits an increase on the tax levy to 2%. So we could not comply with this even if we were inclined to raise taxes by $30 million, which I can say confidently that we are not. But the tax cap law prohibits districts from moving as S2 is designing districts to move. Consequently, we are not achieving an adequate amount of money to provide a thorough and efficient education. So we are, as Chuck said, we are below adequacy, right? Which is our trend of adequacy is going down. Last year we were 1.5 million below adequacy. This year we're 4.8 million below adequacy, and that trend's going to continue. It's going to continue throughout the full implementation of S2, which has 3 years remaining. Next year, it's targeted at about the same level of reduction as this year, and then the 2 years following that, it goes down to maybe 4 million and then 2 million. But again, they're all compounding on each other. At the end of the day, our state aid will be approximately 20 million instead of $50 million. But that is really the core issue that has set us on the path that we find ourselves on today, right? Because as you all know, the mechanics of it might be interesting if you're interested in that kind of stuff, but conceptually, the less money you have coming in, the less money you'll have available to do other things, right? And so that manifests itself in a couple different ways, and I think it's worth our time to touch base on all of those things so that you understand the impact of that as it stands right now. So up here we have property tax changes as a result of the 2% increase in the tax levy. And I want to spend just a moment talking about how the district's tax levy is allocated among the 8 municipalities that contribute to it. The state performs that calculation, determines the calculation, imposes it on the district, and we comply with it. We don't have, it's not something that we develop internally. That calculation is used only for what we're talking about here tonight, the allocation of that tax rate. So here's how they did it. They split each municipality's property value, equalized value, by the percentage of elementary students and high school students. So if there is changes in enrollment at either levy, it changes that percentage split and therefore changes the impact it has on the allocation of Freehold Regional's tax levy. Those are the factors: school-aged enrollment, equalized value. So the high school side of that, for each of the 8 municipalities, is added up, and then your specific municipality's percentage of that total is your percentage share of the levy. Now, because of shifts in a number of factors and in all or some of the communities, it's hard to isolate the impact of it. We're gonna drill down on one example, just so that you can have a sense of it. But this methodology is abrupt, it's volatile, it's something that we have met with legislators about to come up with a way to smooth those edges some. A rolling 3-year average, something like that may cause not such abrupt changes each year that goes by. Let's look back at over 5 years per municipality. And you can see just by a view of the graph there, for each municipality, they're up, they're down, they're up, they're down. And that can happen for things that may be happening in their municipality or in others. That causes the percentage share to change. So let's go down even further and look at Manalapan's, who's seeing the highest percentage increase this year, and look at their history of up and down. For this year, here's what's impacted Manalapan. The elementary school enrollment dropped by 5.5%. That was a large drop for Manalapan compared to other districts, other municipalities. It was a considerable drop. The high school enrollment only dropped 0.8%, right? So the drop in elementary is far more than the drop in high school, which means that when they're splitting the equalized value of the community, more of that percentage is pushed into the high school column, okay? And because it moves into the high school column, it then becomes part of the calculation to allocate the remaining levy. So for just that reason, there's been a shift in the percentage share of the levy that Manalapan seen. Now, that could reverse itself next year. Even if a municipality is exactly the same as they were the year before, they're going to see changes because there are changes happening in the other municipalities that's causing their high school piece of equalized valuation to change, and therefore their percentage share. So it's not something that can be easily isolated to one municipality, one of the variables in that municipality. For this year, it actually is evident that the majority of that impact is because of the drop in elementary enrollment. Everybody feeling comfortable with that explanation or with understanding how that process works? Board, any questions on how that moves? Okay. All right, thank you. Trish, can you move to the next slide? So on the appropriation side, as I had mentioned earlier, we've stabilized our operation for the time being, but I did want to include this to show just what categories that money is falling into. So it's essentially a 60-40 split in direct instruction versus support services, administration, transportation facilities, in those areas. Something that I'd like to just emphasize while we're here is that the capital piece, which you can barely even see, but you can see the word capital and 0.1%, and that's really for equipment. The annual budget is one of the areas that you can raise funding to do capital projects, large-scale capital projects, think like roof replacement, that type of thing. There are three areas. Another area is a referendum, which is a separate and independent from the annual budget. Independent of that, it's a separate vote, and it's funded with new dollars. The third is capital reserves, which I touched on earlier. Capital reserves can only be funded through the annual budget. So really, the annual budget and a referendum are the only two opportunities to fund, to accumulate funds to pay for big ticket facility improvements. Because S2 has cut our revenue, as you would imagine, our budgets become tighter and tighter. And the amount lapsing at the end of any given year, which would normally be our opportunity to deposit some money into our facility reserves, we haven't been able to do that because we need all of those dollars in order to put towards the next budget we build. Both of those areas have been severely impacted by S2. There was a time here in this budget prior to S2 and just prior to S2 where the district would build in a certain level of financial efforts in each annual budget to do some big ticket facility projects. Over a 10-year period of time, this district put close to $10 million towards roofing and paving alone. But the opportunity to do that within an annual budget, an annual operation, has been diminished to a point that is no longer viable. Which is why in tonight's presentation, we're shifting some of the most critical and urgent needs to a very limited scope referendum that we're going to be putting before the community on November 2nd. So for appropriations, as revenues decline, the appropriations contract. Our tolerance for assuming risk has gone up, and we've reached really the end of the road in that option, which is why we are now moving and proposing a referendum going forward. Trish, next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, the spending metric that's most commonly used by the state and in a comparable way is the Taxpayer's Guide to Education Spending. So what we did here was all of the different groupings, we took what's the average of all of the districts in that particular grouping and compared it to Freehold Regional directly. Next to Freel Regional, the gray it's all of the high school districts in the state. There are 31 high school districts in the state, and you can see how we match up to those. So our spending, we fare very well in this measure. We have the economy of scale to do that, having 10,000 high school students. But more importantly than the economics of it, which makes a lot of sense, is it affords us the opportunity to offer programs because there's a critical mass of student interest. Whereas in smaller districts, there may not be enough students with that particular interest to support a program of the nature that we have here with a dozen magnet programs that we have. So I think that's the more important benefit of having the scale of high school students that we have. So that concludes the annual budget portion of this, and I'm going to shift into the capital referendum portion of it. So we're at a point that after failing 2 referendums, one in 18 and one in 19, we've really pulled back and shown a great amount of restraint on what we're going to put forward for the community and ask for their support. The process for that, for a November election, is action tonight to endorse the project and gets things in motion. Then at the August board meeting, it would be to finalize the bond question for the November election. It's worth noting that this process from now until August is to submit applications for New Jersey Department of Education, Office of School Facility Approval. So the state reviews the plans. That's pretty straightforward plans that we have for roofing and paving. There's nothing complex about that. And it's also the 3rd time that we've put this particular scope of work down to the state for review. The state, though, is it's something that we don't have direct control over. So we are aware of the timelines, and we need to make them very aware of the timelines as well. That's something we'll be keeping you all posted on as the months pass. Thank you, Trish. So the next slide here's the scope of work that we're proposing to include in the referendum. $14,460,000 is the number. And this comprises the most urgent areas of roofing and paving, what we're calling priority 1. Priority 2 are areas of work that will need to be addressed or will come due 3 to 5 years from now. So in designing an overall sort of approach to how we're going to fund this, we were inclined to be very specific about the things that are the most urgent needs and put those up there, while at the same time putting in place a mechanism to generate funding that can be accumulated to address the second tier of priorities, priority 2 here for roofing and paving. So in doing so, in identifying that, we looked at solar options, and we looked at those for consideration within the referendum or through what's called a power purchase agreement, which is another option for it that doesn't need upfront cost. So we also looked at that. Either way we approach that, it does generate economic benefit. And that economic benefit would be dedicated to depositing into our facility-related reserves in order to accumulate money to fund projects down the road 3 to 5 years, and other areas of our facilities that need improvement as well along the way. Ultimately, we decided to not include solar in the referendum and to pursue the PPA aspect of it, because we wanted to really be pinpoint, accurate, and very reasonable in what we put forward and ask the community to support. So to walk us through some of that process, the assessment process, and the scope of work, Ted Hopkins from our architect group is here to touch base on some of that for us. So Ted, if you would.
evening, everybody. Thank you, Sean. I wanted to quickly go through what we did, the process, share on the review, but with anybody from the public, what we did not, and it's very important to note, we did not just take the old referendum information and just peel that out and start with that and go from there and just, resubmit them. On the morning of March 3rd, we met with Pat Brownness and Matt in their offices, and kind of wanted to make sure that we went through a process I think was kind of give it a fresh look. One thing about paving and roofing is they change very quickly, or they have the ability to change very quickly, because they're exposed to the weather constantly. So those things can and do change rather radically. So we wanted to make sure that, from a year and a half ago, when the referendum, or two, I guess, ago, we would take a fresh look at it and make sure that we got the warranty information correct on the roofing and really give that a fresh look. So on March 3rd, we walked all of the roofs of every building, all 6 buildings in the district. And again, having that information, double checking to make sure the warranties were correct and accurate, but did not use just that as the basis of whether something was good or bad. I've said this to you before, I'll say it again. Just because it's new doesn't mean it's good, just because it's old doesn't mean it's bad. Pat and Matt agreed with that, and we wanted to take a fresh look. Having done that, you look at the drawing that you have, you basically broke things into 3 categories. The white category was roofs that are doing great, they're under warranty, and there's really no reason at this point in time to include those in the referendum. The red areas were areas that were definitely we're finding some leakage. They're not performing well. Most likely they are out of warranty, although there are some slight tweaks to that. Again, old, new kind of a thing. So we wanted to take a look at it, make sure that we assessed it exactly how it should be assessed, not by just looking at the warranty. So the red areas were again, not performing well. Leaks are being found on a regular basis, and strong consideration. The yellow areas were areas that were under warranty, perhaps coming to the end of their warranty, or areas that had already approached their warranty and passed, but were performing well. Areas that were not seeing any kind of leakage of any kind, and really performing as good as it can be given the parameters in the year of their lifespan. So I really broke it into those 3 categories. The red then became priority 1, the yellow became priority 2, and again, over the years, as he said, 3 to 5 years, we will keep an eye on those roofs. They may develop more quickly than others into from good to bad, but at this point in time, we didn't find a reason to include those in the referendum. The white areas, in particular, might have we just did them for you. They might have a expiration of 2036, so they're recently done. No reason to be bringing those into the process at this time. So again, we walked every roof and made that assessment at each of the 6 facilities, and this is what we came up with. We believe that these are the highest priority in the red areas. The yellow areas, again, we'll keep an eye on over the years, make sure they don't change radically, make some slight adjustments to that if we need to, and the white areas, we'll address that much further down the road. A week later, we went out and we did the same exact thing for the paving. Now, again, warranties aren't in play here, but they do have longevities, and a normal longevity, that doesn't mean that is exactly what it should be. Paving should last in the neighborhood of 15 to 25 years, depending on how many times the buses or cars roll over. And sometimes it doesn't even take that. But a normal lifespan is 20 years. So having some of that knowledge, again, we look for severe cracking. We look for what we call alligatoring, and that means that there's a soft spot underneath of there that breaks the asphalt into smaller areas, maybe as big as my hand, and that's continuous. So it's not a crack linear in nature or even squiggly in nature. It's an area that has severe distress, and the the stone and the strata, we'll call it dirt, soil underneath that, is not performing, it's getting soft. There may be areas of compaction going bad, areas that are getting wet. And that's a very natural thing. It's going to happen over time. Again, we divided that into two, the red areas being what you would think, the worst areas, severe cracking. What we're talking about here in the red is full reconstruction. What does that mean? That means I take everything down to the stone. I don't do a milling, which is basically taking the top coating off and putting asphalt back on top of it. We remove it down to the stone, give it a new base, and build it back up, pitch it properly, make sure that it is pitched properly to the drains that are on the perimeter, sometimes in the middle, and work it back to almost like it's absolutely brand new. That brand new should last, again, 20, 25 years if everything is working well and performing well. There are spots we would have to maybe take out a little bit more to make sure that we're hitting really good soil and getting really good compaction to about 95%. That's the number that we're looking for when we do all of our testing. The yellow areas are the areas that are doing okay. In this case, the yellow areas, at only 3 of the buildings, if you looked at the sheet that Sean put up there, were mostly dedicated, believe it or not, towards the busing areas where the bus is maintained. They come in, they loop, they drop off kids, they pick kids up. So that, what I'm looking at there is Freehold Township High School. And again, the yellow areas where the buses loop along the left side and then across the front of the building. But the red areas were the worst areas. And again, we believe that is the area that should warrant the basically strict attention to it in a very short amount of time before it deteriorates anymore, causing potholes, causing areas where cars could be damaged in some way, shape, or form. I'm not saying it's that like that, but I could get to that. And then we'll take a look at the yellow over time and make sure that we can maybe spot address those things. And again, those things will come to the end of their life as well. Keep an eye on it over time. Solar. We did look at both ways of addressing this. With the start from Dr. Sampson, I remember the first meeting we had with him before we went out, we wanted to take a look at solar and what the benefits could be to the district. We did a recent project, a referendum project, if you will, with Monmouth Regional High School. We merely wanted to bring those ideas to the table and see if it worked. And just finishing that project, we are about ready to flip the switch, which is very exciting. It's about a 600 kW system at Monmouth Regional High School. We understand the risks that are involved with the SREC program, with the TREC program that people are being transferred into, and then hopefully onto the new SREC program that follows. But we certainly understand that a PPA is certainly a great benefit as you create that energy for your building. It's not a direct energy for the building, but certainly it certainly generates a significant amount of electricity that gets sent back into the grid, and you obviously are the benefit. Each building is the benefit of that. So while we looked at it, we wanted to make sure we present both options. Had many conversations with Sean about this, especially over the last week or so, and good conversations. And want to make sure that, again, we offer that as an option. We do PPAs all the time. We're doing a PPA right now for Robbinsville. We're doing other PPAs. My partner is doing others as well. We're about ready to start a PPA down in Summers Point. They all vary. They all have different parameters to them. None of them are the same. But I believe that at least going down the road and reviewing this is a positive thing. Please note, timing is also important as well. I think the PPA allows the roofs to be done in the areas where you saw white and red. Understanding that the red areas would be done over time, and the PPA would use those roofs as well as the white roofs, which has a longevity as well. and use those areas for a PPA, and we think that's a significant amount at each of the schools, some a little bit more, some a little bit less. And certainly able to take advantages of that system. After 15 years, as I'm sure you know, you have the opportunity to buy the system or to have them remove it and start all over again, however you want. That's a decision that's 15 years down the road from the implementation of that system. So again, I think it is important that you look at those, certainly respect the decision that is made to perhaps look at the PPA once the roofs are done, and I think that's a wise decision.
Thanks, Ted. The solar component of this, I think the important piece of that for tonight is that it's part of the systemic mechanism to accumulate funds for the yellow areas and other projects, tennis courts and the like, that the district has. It fits into the structural design of our finances beyond the view of any one annual budget. And it's things like this, I think, are what are essential to be in place as we move forward under the remainder of S2 and then post S2 at the lowest levels of funding that